Here's what we're going to do and why. If you've used FactoryBot before, you've seen these factory definitions that look like this, and you've created your own factory definitions. You might kind of understand how they work, but you might not understand the details of the syntax. So our objective in this video will be to demystify this FactoryBot syntax. And we're going to build our own reverse engineered version of the FactoryBot syntax. And in doing so, we'll learn how this syntax works exactly in all its details. Concepts we'll learn about include blocks, message sending, the distinction between calling a method on an object and sending a message to an object, and we'll learn about something called method missing. With that said, let's dive in. I have this factory definition here, which is identical to a regular FactoryBot definition, except it's not FactoryBot, it's my FactoryBot, as you can see by that class name on line 1 there. So here's how we're going to go about coding this. You can see lines 8 through 10 here, where I'm using this factory that I've created. On line 8, I'm saying user equals myFactoryBot.create user, just like how in FactoryBot we say FactoryBot.create user or whatever the entity is. And then I'm outputting the first name and last name attributes of the user to show that those attributes match what was set inside the factory. The method that I'm going to use to develop this code is what I call error-driven development. So you're probably familiar with test-driven development, where every piece of code has a failing test first. You write the test, it fails, then you write the code that makes the test pass. What we're going to do is write some code, try to run it, observe the error we see, and then write the code that will make the error go away. And then we'll repeat. So it's a little bit like test-driven development, but a little more lightweight, because if I TDD'd all this code, it would just be such a complicated demonstration, and it would distract from the point. With that said, let's run this code and observe our first error. You can see at the bottom left that this file is called myFactorybot.rb. So I am going to do Rails R, short for Rails run, myFactorybot.rb. You can see that our first error is uninitialized constant myFactorybot. That makes sense. We haven't defined anything called myFactorybot. So I'm going to go back over here, and above myFactorybot, I'm going to say class myFactorybot. And I would expect that that change makes my error go away. Let's see if it does. Okay, it did make that error go away. Now we're getting a different error. It says undefined method define for myFactorybot class. Okay, where's that coming from? Define. Okay, so here on line 4, it says myFactorybot.define, and of course we haven't defined a method called define, so we'll define it. Okay, and as part of error-driven development, similar to test-driven development, I'm never going to write a piece of code without first seeing an error, and I'm only going to write enough code to make the error go away. So if we run this again, that does in fact make the error go away, and we now get a different error. Undefined method create for myFactorybot class. So let's see what that's all about. Create. Okay, line 13 is where create is being called. We should be able to solve this the same way, just by defining a method called create on the myFactorybot class. Let's see what we get now. Wrong number of arguments, given 1, expected 0. Okay, that's on line 5 for create. Okay, we passed an argument to create, but in our method definition, we're not expecting an argument. So let's change our method definition so that it does expect an argument. What is user? Well, that's a symbol that corresponds to the name of a model. So I'm going to say model sim because even though I'm not typically a big fan of abbreviations and variable names, sim is an idiomatic abbreviation for symbol in Ruby. We will run this again. Okay, different error. Undefined method first name for nil class. Okay, that's on line 17. And yeah, in fact, we're not giving any return value on this create method that we're defining on line 5. Just to make the error go away, we can code it in the dumbest way possible, which is just to return an instance of user.new. Obviously, it's not ultimately going to be acceptable to just return a hard-coded value like this. We want the model name to be dynamic, of course, because we want to be able to use more models than just this specific user model. But that should at least make the error go away. Let's see. Yep, that made that particular error go away. And in fact, now we no longer have any errors. However, our factory doesn't work. We just get blank for first name and last name. So we'll have to think now of what we want to do next, because our errors up until now were prompting us what to do next, and so the next step was always easy. Now it's a little bit more challenging. So here's our local objective. We want it so the user object gets populated with a first name and a last name. Specifically, we want the user first name to get populated with what's on line 12, John, and we want the last name to get populated with Smith from line 13. So how do we get those values from the one place to the other place? You can see on line 2 with the define method, the define method wraps everything else, but we're not actually doing anything with the define method. So we can tell that we're going to have to do something with this block that's passed to define in order for anything to work. Even though it's maybe not abundantly clear how to get this user's first name and last name onto the user object, it at least is abundantly clear that we're going to need to get this block involved somehow. So maybe we can start there. So define accepts a block. So how can we get this define method to invoke the block that's passed to it? Well, here's how. We can give the define method a parameter of ampersand block, and we'll talk a little bit more in a second about what exactly that means. And then in the body of define, we can call the block by doing block.call. Now, if we go and run this, we get an error. Undefined method factory for main object. Okay, what's that all about? On line 12, we have factory. Factory is a method. We're calling a method called factory, but we've never actually defined a method called factory, and that's why we're getting that error. And we'll address that, but first, let's come back to this ampersand block parameter in the define method and talk about what that means. So here's what this ampersand block parameter is all about. The ampersand in front of block signifies that this is a special kind of parameter. Let me show how that works. Let's say we didn't have the ampersand. We just had block instead, and we tried to run this. We get an error that says define, wrong number of arguments, given 0, expected 1. Okay, so define here is expecting 1 argument, but we didn't give it any arguments. All we did was we called the define method and we passed a block. And a block and an argument are not exactly the same thing. So it's saying, hey, you said you expected 1 argument, but you didn't send any arguments. Okay, so let's change this back to an ampersand. and we'll run it again and verify that we don't get that error anymore. We only get this factory related error, which is irrelevant to the block. I want to demonstrate one other thing about this block parameter, which is this. Let's say that instead of doing myFactoryBot.define and then passing a block, we call myFactoryBot.define foo. We're passing in foo as the block argument. It does not like that. It says wrong number of arguments, given 1, expected 0. So again, this ampersand signifies that this block parameter is a special kind of parameter. You can't pass just anything. You have to pass a block. Okay, now that we've discussed what this block parameter is all about, let's turn our attention back to this other error that says undefined method factory for main object. Here's a naive way we could fix this. We could just define a method called factory, and it takes an argument. We'll put model sim here. So we could do this and make this error go away, presumably. Let's see what that does. Okay, when we run that, there are no errors now. So that seems like it kind of solves the problem, but what have we really accomplished? We just defined this method. It lives outside the myFactoryBot class and has no access to anything inside of myFactoryBot. So it's going to be kind of useless because it's just hanging out here all on its own. How are we ever going to get access to the information in first name and last name? Just to illustrate the point further, I'll do this. You can see that the factory method also takes a block, so we can do block.call here. And if we run that, we see undefined method first name for main object. So we could do this again, first name. We'll do last name also. Okay, no errors now, but how are we now going to take these two values of John and Smith and get them all the way back there to line 7 for the create method? We can't. There's no way to do it. So we have to take a completely different approach. What we have to do is we need to execute this factory method inside the context of myFactoryBot. So let's do that, and let's get rid of these 3 methods, and I'll run this file again so that we can verify that we get that same error message as before, undefined method factory for main object. So let's talk about how to get that factory method to execute within the context of the myFactoryBot class. So before we talk about this, we need to talk about a little bit more conceptual stuff so that we can better understand what we're about to do. So you're of course familiar with the concept of calling methods on objects. Well, in Ruby, we often put it a little bit differently. We say that we send a message to an object. So here's a little example. Let's say we instantiate an array. We'll call it A. A equals array.new. We'll create an array with 5 elements. They just all come out nil. That's fine. We can pass a message. We can send a message to A. We can do A.toS. So we're sending A the message to S. And this array, the array object, responds to the toS message, and it gives us back the stringified version of the array. Now let's send our array instance a different message. We'll do A.toI. This is a message that array does not respond to. It says undefined method toI for array. And we can see that if we do A.respond to S, we get true. If we do respond to I, we get false. So this is all to illustrate that what we're doing is sending messages to objects. I don't want to use the language of calling methods. I want to say that we're sending messages. That's going to be important. So now we're going to come back to our MyFactoryBot class, and we're going to run this file again, and we're going to take a closer look at the error message we get. Okay, look at that last line. It says undefined method factory for main object. All right, so this is happening on line 12. So if we look at line 12, we see that we're calling this method called factory. All right, so that's where the error's originating. Let's look at the error message again. Undefined method factory. Okay, that part makes sense because we, in fact, don't have a method defined called factory. But it says for main object. What is that all about? Well, let's now think about the fact that when we call a method in Ruby, we're sending a message to an object. And every time we send a message, that message has some receiver. So let's go back to our array example for a second. A equals array.new 5, and then we attempt to do a.toI, which of course doesn't work. We were attempting to send the toI message to this A object. It was saying undefined method blah 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 array. So it's basically saying this instance of array doesn't respond to toI. So if we look at this undefined method factory error, it's saying what doesn't respond to the factory method is this main object. So what's the main object? Well, in Ruby, everything happens within the context of an object, and even when there is no object, seemingly, there's still this main object. Let's demonstrate something real quick. So I'm still in the IRB console here. Let's just type in ASDF and hit enter and see what happens. If we do that, it says undefined local variable or method ASDF for main object. So it's trying to send this message ASDF to main. So now that we've covered all that, let's go back yet again to our MyFactoryBot definition, and let's run it yet again. And we'll look at this error message again, an undefined method factory for main object. And now this error message might be a little more clear. So we need to get factory to be sent not to main, but we want factory to be sent to something else, maybe this MyFactoryBot class. So here's how we can do that. Instead of doing block.call, we can use this method called instanceExec and pass the block that way. Now let's watch what happens when we run this again. Okay, now instead of saying undefined method factory for main object, it says undefined method factory for MyFactoryBot class. So we can see that it's attempting to send this message not to main now, but to MyFactoryBot. Okay, now let's remember that we're practicing error-driven development, so we want to just add just enough code to make this error message go away. So I think we can do that by saying def self.factory. Okay, let's see what we get when we run this now. Wrong number of arguments, given 1, expected 0. Makes sense, because we're passing this user argument to factory, but I didn't define any parameters on my factory method. So let's do that. I'll call it model sim because this is a symbol that represents a model, corresponds to a model. Run this again, what do we get? Okay, no errors now, but again, no values for first name and last name. So we'll have to fix that somehow. I'm not too sure how we're going to fix that, but let's not even worry about that for right now, because we know that somehow we'll have to bring this first name and last name on line 16 and 17 into the picture. So this block that's being passed to this factory method, we'll have to call that block. So we can change this factory method slightly. We can add this special block parameter. And then here we can say instance exec block, because we don't want to just call it like we did in the very beginning with the other block, because we saw what that gets us. That gets us the block executing in the context of main, and we don't want to do that at all anymore. We want to keep the context within our own objects. So let's see what we get when we run this. Okay, now it says undefined method first name for myFactoryBot class. Now, we could just keep going in this manner, and we could add a first name and last name method. But if we do that, okay, we see first name, and that makes the error messages go away. But where are we really headed when we do this? We just have all these class methods. And if we only have class methods, then we can't really mix any data into the picture. And we need to mix some data into the picture because we need to get this John and Smith into there. So let's kind of review what we've done so far, and that might help us figure out where to go. So when we're calling this create method on line 28, what we're returning is an instance of a user object. And we want to somehow get John and Smith into that user object. So I think what we probably want is we want to create a new object that has this user instance as a property on it, so that we can then deal with that actual object instance. Because when we're dealing with this myFactoryBot class with its class methods, we're not actually ever instantiating anything. And so if we want to be able to hang on to something permanently and deal with its data, we need to instantiate an object. So let's do this. Let's create a new class called myFactory. Okay, and I actually want to take away first name and last name. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to be able to see these errors, and I want to be able to see the context in which the first name and last name messages are being sent. I want to see what the receiver is for those messages. So right now, the receiver for first name is myFactoryBot. I want to change the context so that it's my factory that's receiving first name rather than myFactoryBot. In order to do that, we can do this. We can say factory equals myFactory.new, and then we can do factory.instanceExec block. Let's see what we get now. Okay, now the context has changed. The receiver has changed. It's now saying undefined method first name for myFactory. So now let's make that error go away by doing def first name and def last name. And notice how these aren't class methods, these are instance methods, because we're dealing with an instance of myFactory. Okay, no errors. Now how can we get these John and Smith values into the picture? Well, we want to set those values on an instance of a user object, but we don't really have access to a user object right now to set those values on. But that's pretty easy to fix. We can do it like this. We can create an initialize method. We can say user equals user.new. Okay. Notice how on lines 30 and 31, when we're calling first name and last name, we're not passing arguments, we're actually giving each one of those methods a block. In the first one, we have a block that just has a string John. In the second one, we have a block that just has a string Smith. So here's what we can do. If we want to get a hold of those values, John and Smith, we can add a special block argument to first name, and we can say user.firstname equals block.call. All right, and I'm going to put a binding.pry here so we can see what's happening. I'll run this, and it's going to land here, and I'm going to do user.firstname is John, because the return value of block.call is John. However, we can see that first name and last name are still blank. Why is that? Well, let's come back here. And before we do anything more, let's add a last name method that is analogous to this first name method. And the reason that first name and last name are blank when we run the file, I'll just show you again, first name and last name are blank, is because we're doing user equals myFactoryBot.create, user.firstname, user.lastname. The myFactoryBot.create method, it only returns an instance of user. So our myFactory instance is completely disconnected from what actually gets returned from myFactoryBot.create. So we'll need to figure out a way to connect those two things. Before I do anything, before I make any changes, I want to reorganize this a little bit so that it's easier to understand. So if we go down here, sequentially, this factory method gets called before the create method does. But up here, the create method appears before the factory method. I think it would be a little bit more clear if we put the factory method before the create method, since that's the order in which those two methods get called. Now that I've done that, what if we change factory from a local variable to an instance variable? And then in create, instead of returning user.new, we return factory.user. Okay, let's give that a try. When we run this, it unsurprisingly gives us this error, undefined method user for myFactory. That makes sense because there in fact is no method user on myFactory. So let's add @reader user so that we can access that user instance variable. Okay, and look, now instead of first name and last name being blank, first name is John and last name is Smith. And let's review a little bit what we did here. We changed factory in the factory method from being a local variable to an instance variable, so that when it comes time to call this create method, we can return the same user that we've instantiated in the factory method. And that's how we can make it so the values that are set inside the factory make it to the place where we use the factory. Now, this is great that we have things working, but there's still more to be done. What if, for example, we wanted to do something like this? Our user database table has an email column. Our user model has an email attribute. So we ought to be able to put an email attribute in our factory and have it work. But if we try to do so, we get this error, undefined method email for myFactory. And that makes sense because we don't have an email method. All we have is first name and last name. And we, of course, can't just keep hard coding more and more methods because we don't know what attributes people are going to want to use on our factories. So we're going to have to do something different. We have to somehow make it so these first name and last name methods aren't hard coded. So we're going to start from the inside and work our way outward. The first thing I'm going to change is line 24 here. Instead of the hard-coded user.firstname, I'm going to take advantage of Ruby's send method. And before we do that, let's comment out this problematic line here and run the file again, just to make sure that when we perform our refactoring, we're starting from a working state. So I'm going to show you something that you might not know about assigning a value to an active record object. watch this. I'm going to change user.firstname equals block.call to this. Now we have user.firstname equals, and then in parentheses, block.call, as if there's a method called firstname equals that we can call, because there actually is a method called firstname equals that we can call. If I run our file again, you can see that it still works because what we just changed this to is totally valid. And you'll see why I did this when we move on to the next step. I'm going to change this yet again. Instead of hard coding user.firstname equals, I'm going to say user.send firstname equals as the first argument to send. Then I'll put block.call as the second argument. So I'm going to put all these next to each other. User.firstname equals block.call. All three of these lines are equivalent. I took it from the standard syntax to the firstname equals method syntax, and now I'm making it more general by using Ruby's send method, where the first argument is the message that we're passing, and the second argument is the argument that we're using for that message that we're sending. Okay, and if we run this, it still works. I'm going to do the same thing with last name. Check to make sure that still works. And it does. And if it's not clear why I wanted to switch to using send, it will be in a moment. So what we have to do now is figure out some way to make it so that we don't have these first name and last name methods explicitly defined, but we need a way to accept any message that is passed to us and make use of it. And in order to do that, we're going to use Ruby's method missing method. So method missing is what will get invoked when our object receives a message that it doesn't know how to handle. And I'll show you how this works. Let's say we just don't have a first name method. If we put a binding.pry here, we can see that we'll get put into method missing when first name is called. So I'll run this, and indeed we're here. What are these arguments equal to? Well, atter is first name. That's the message that's being passed. Args, in this case, happens just to be empty array. And then there's a block. And that's our block which has the John value in it. So let's now make it so that our method missing method behaves equivalently to how our first name method was behaving. We should be able to do that by doing something similar to what we did before. In fact, because first name is the only one that will invoke method missing right now, because it's the only method that's missing, we can just hard code first name and we should get the same behavior. And indeed we do. But obviously we don't want to hard code it ultimately. So we'll change this from first name to use this atter value. And remember, atter was the message that was being passed. So we can change this from a hard-coded first name to atter, and that should work. Indeed it does. Okay, and now that we've generalized method missing, we should be able to take out last name and expect that to work as well. Indeed it does. And now we should be able to uncomment that email line, and it just might work. So let's do that. Try to run it again. Okay, it didn't give any errors, but we don't see the actual email value. So let's add that. email is user.email. And in fact, it works just fine. There is still a little bit more work to do because this factory we've defined is very specific to a user. We could never use it for any other model. In fact, watch this. Let's say we have another model called website, which in fact I do in this Rails application, and we want to define a factory for website. If we try to run this, it won't work. It says undefined method name for user. So we have this website model with a name attribute, and the name attribute is hitting method missing up here, and it's trying to send a name message to the user object, and it's a miss because there's no name method. User doesn't respond to a message called name. And in fact, we shouldn't be calling it on user, of course. We should be calling it on website. So we have to make our factory a little more general so that these places where it's referring to a user, it just refers to whatever model we happen to be using. So the first thing we can do is easy. We can just change the terminology a little bit so it's less specific. So instead of factory.user, we can do factory.record. Okay. So during our refactoring, I'm going to take out this website factory for a moment. Okay, the user factory still works fine. So the one place where we still have user hard-coded where we shouldn't is here where we're doing user.new. So we're going to have to pass in the model somehow. Okay, so this is in the initialize method of myFactory. So here where we're doing myFactory.new, let's initialize it passing in model sim, and then initialize can take model sim, and instead of user.new, we can do model sim.toS.classify.constantize.new. And that's a lot, so let's look at what that means real quick. I'll put a binding.pry right here. Run this. Okay, so model sim is just user. Model sim.toS, of course, is going to be user like that. And then if I do classify, that will convert the U to uppercase. And then if I do constantize, that'll give me the user class. Then of course, if I put a .new on it, it'll give me a user instance. So in the spirit of checking things after every little change, let's run our file again, verify that it works, and it does. And now if we search for user, there's nowhere in our class where it refers to user. So we might be able to use this website factory now and expect it to work, or at least it'll fail in a different way from before. Okay, we get this error now. Method missing, undefined method first name for website. Why is that happening? Well, here's the sequence of events. We're defining our user factory, meaning that we're calling this factory method. And when we call the factory method, we're setting this factory instance variable to an instance of a user. And then down here on line 37, we're calling the factory method again. And this factory instance variable is getting overwritten to an instance of a website. And then we're saying myFactoryBot.createUser. But look, when we call create, it's not actually hooked up to anything. The symbol that we pass it doesn't make any difference at all. It just uses the same factory instance variable, even though the most recent thing we did was that we set this instance variable to an instance of a website. So we need to change myFactorybot so that the symbol we pass here actually means something. It can't just keep overwriting this factory instance variable with the most recent thing that we set it to. We need to somehow preserve each thing that it gets set to. So what we want is, instead of a single instance variable, we want a hash so that we can have a user key, user value, website key, website value. So let's do this. First, we'll replace factory with factories, and we'll say factories model sim equals myFactory.new model sim. Okay, so that'll make it so we can have a user key and a website key. And then here in create, we'll have to use that specific factory. Now we're actually using this model sim that we're passing in. So this is not going to work. And the reason it doesn't work is because in the beginning, factories is nil. So we'll have to say factories or equals empty hash. Okay, and now we get no errors, but we don't actually have any evidence that our website factory is working. So let's actually use our website factory. Website was myFactorybot.create website. Name is website.name. URL is website.url. Let's see if that works. Okay, and let's put a space to make it easier to read, a blank line. Okay, so our first output here, we have first name, last name, email, and then for our website, we have the name and URL of the website. So now we are done. This is a factory that is general enough to be used for any model. Let's review here. We can see our myFactorybot class and our myFactory class. And maybe the more interesting thing to look at is the usages of the code we wrote. These factories are pretty much indistinguishable from FactoryBot factories. So we've completely reversed engineered, at least for these particular use cases, the FactoryBot syntax. Now it's important to note that FactoryBot doesn't actually work exactly like this. I didn't even look very much at the FactoryBot source code, so the code that we wrote probably bears very little resemblance to the actual FactoryBot code. And there's probably ways that we could write our code more elegantly and stuff like that, but for the purposes of this illustration, this is pretty much fine. My objective with this demonstration was not necessarily to end up with beautiful, elegant code, but to illustrate the principles behind FactoryBot code and to show that it's not magic, it's just Ruby, and to take this FactoryBot syntax from being something that's maybe mysterious to something that's not mysterious. With that, thanks for watching and happy coding.